The midday sun blazed mercilessly over the Serengeti, baking the savanna in a sweltering silence. Heat waves shimmered across the golden grasslands, distorting the horizon and turning the air itself into a thick, weighty presence. Dust clung to everything: boots, clothes, the windshield of the patrol vehicle grinding down the dry, cracked road that wound through the southern edge of the park. Inside the Land Cruiser, 4 rangers sat quiet and focused. They were exhausted after a long morning surveying drought-stricken areas and dried-up watering holes. Recording signs of animal stress and migration shifts. The task was routine, but the consequences were anything but. Prolonged dry seasons were becoming more common, and every shift of the ecosystem echoed through the food chain. David, the team leader, sat in the passenger seat with a notebook open on his lap. Brow furrowed in concentration. Behind the wheel, Joseph squinted through the sun glare, hands steady on the wheel. In the back, Rehema and Juma, 2 younger rangers, sat silently, watching the land slip past with an unspoken wariness. Then the silence shattered. A deep, guttural roar exploded from the road ahead, followed by a sound far stranger, a low, throaty hiss that seemed too loud, too deliberate, to be just wind or grass. Joseph braked hard, tires screeching on sun-baked asphalt. Dust curled up in a thick cloud around the vehicle as all 4 rangers jolted forward. Hearts racing. What the hell was that? Juma asked, already unbuckling. David had his binoculars up before anyone else, scanning the stretch of road ahead. He froze. His hand dropped to his belt instinctively, hovering over his machete. "Oh my God," he muttered. They all turned to look. About 40 meters ahead, right in the center of the road, a horrific scene had unfolded. A massive lioness lay trapped in the crushing coils of a full-grown African rock python, the largest either of them had ever seen. Its thick, mottled body wound around the lioness's torso and neck like an iron vise, muscles shifting with terrifying power as it tightened with each breath. The lioness kicked feebly, claws digging at the road. But her strength was fading. Beside her, a large male lion paced back and forth, roaring in fury and confusion. Every time he took a step closer, the python flared its head toward him, hissing violently. Its jaws parted just enough to show the hook teeth it rarely needed. The male lion would rear back, letting out another helpless roar, unable to act without risking the lioness's life. The rangers didn't hesitate. "Out, now!" David shouted, flinging open the door. They hit the ground running. Joseph grabbed the pry bar and a wooden pole from the roof rack. Rehema took the flare gun. Juma armed himself with a long iron rod used for tire changes. They dealt with poachers, injured elephants, even rabid hyenas, but this was different. This was nature locked in mortal combat, and they had only minutes to act. Juma, come with me from the left. Rehema, take the high ground behind that rock. Joseph, front. Steady, David ordered, already advancing. The python didn't move as they approached, still focused on finishing what it had started. The lioness had stopped struggling. Her sides moved rapidly, shallowly, Her eyes rolled in pain. "She's slipping," Rehema said urgently, crouching with her tool raised. "If we wait any longer." "We won't," David replied. "On my signal, we distract it. Joseph, go for the head. Juma and I will try to wedge the coils open." The male lion let out a low growl as they approached. For a terrifying second, it looked as if he might charge them too, interpreting their approach as a threat. But then he backed away slightly, as if understanding this strange two-legged pride might be his only allies. David raised a hand. "Now." Joseph stepped forward boldly and banged the metal pole against the road, creating a sharp clang that echoed across the flat plain. The python reared its head in response, flicking its tongue angrily and releasing a chilling hiss. Rehema fired the flare just beyond it into the brush. The sudden burst of fire and noise caused the snake to whip its head toward the sound. Distracted for just a second. It was enough. David and Juma lunged at the same time. David drove the crowbar between two coils and pushed down with all his strength. Muscles screamed in protest, but the coil shifted slightly. Juma braced himself and jammed his rod into the loosened gap, leveraging it upward. The lioness gasped, an audible wheeze of air escaping compressed lungs. The python writhed furiously, sensing its meal slipping away. It tried to reinforce its grip, but Joseph struck it across the back with the pole, again and again, buying precious seconds. Blood trickled down David's hand where the crowbar had scraped skin. But he didn't stop. "Pull now," David yelled. Together, they wrenched the coils just wide enough for the lioness to slide free. She tumbled onto the road, limbs weak and unsteady, lungs drawing in great gasps of air. The python lunged, but missed her by inches. Before it could strike again, the male lion let out an earth-shaking roar and charged. The python reared, unsure whether to fight or flee, but the lion's charge was a blur of muscle and rage. With a swipe of his massive paw, he batted the serpent away, giving his mate the space to crawl to safety. The python, finally overwhelmed, gave up. It slithered across the road and disappeared into the thick underbrush, its body moving like liquid shadow. The lioness lay panting on the side of the road, blood smeared along her flank but alive. The male lion stood over her protectively, breathing hard, watching the rangers not with hostility now, but something closer to recognition. The four rangers stood in silence, chests heaving, weapons lowered. They watched the lioness struggle to her feet. She leaned into the male for support. Slowly, limping but alive, the two lions disappeared into the tall grass, their golden bodies swallowed by the wild. Only after they were gone did the rangers exhale. "That was insane," Juma said, dropping his rod and wiping sweat from his brow. "Insane, but necessary," Joseph replied. David looked at his bloodied hands, then at the disturbed trail of the python in the dust. "We weren't just saving her," he said, "we were saving him, too. That lion would have died trying to save her." Rehema nodded, her face tight with emotion. "They never leave each other, even when it's hopeless." The group stood in the baking sun, hearts pounding with adrenaline and awe. The air still vibrated with the echoes of that last roar, a reminder that even in the wild's harshest moments, love and loyalty exist, feral, fearless, and fierce. Back in the truck, as they finally resumed their drive toward the ranger station, no one spoke for a long time. But they all felt the same thing: respect for the lions, for each other, and for the land that never ceased to surprise them. It was only the beginning. The sun hung mercilessly over the Serengeti, baking the earth into a cracked canvas of dust and heat. In the shimmering light, the scene on the road looked almost surreal. A lioness, once the proud queen of this savanna, now lay helpless, her body coiled tightly by the massive African rock python. The serpent's thick, muscular body flexed with deliberate precision, squeezing the life out of her inch by inch. The lioness gasped weakly, her golden flanks rising and falling in desperate, uneven rhythm. Her eyes, once fierce and full of power, were now cloudy and unfocused. Each breath she drew seemed like a final one. Her paws twitched, more reflex than resistance, claws scraping uselessly against the road. Beside her, the male lion, her mate, paced in a slow, maddened circle. He let out a deep, guttural rumble, not quite a roar but filled with sorrow and fury. Every time he lunged forward to help her, the python reared its head, mouth wide, hissing with primal rage. The lion would halt, helpless, snarling and frustrated, his instincts warring with the reality of the trap. The four rangers stood frozen for a beat. Then training and instinct kicked in. "Hold positions," David shouted, eyes locked on the tightening coils. "Joseph, front left. Keep that head away from her." Joseph grabbed the longest pole they had and advanced carefully. The python's head was now weaving side to side, its attention torn between the male lion and the humans. It sensed danger. Its thick body rippled with muscle, and the coils around the lioness shifted tighter. "She's weakening," Rehema called from behind. She was already crouched at the base of the lioness's body, pulling out a steel pry bar and a rope with a hook. "Juma, with me," David ordered. "We're getting that coil off her lungs." As Joseph positioned himself near the python's head, he drove the pole into the dirt with one hand, using the other to gently press the snake's thick jaw away from the lioness. The serpent recoiled slightly, but didn't retreat. Instead, it hissed again, longer this time, a slow warning that sent chills down Joseph's spine. "I've got the head," he shouted, but not for long. Rehema and David moved into place. David wedged the crowbar under the lowest coil, where the python's grip was strongest, right over the lioness's ribs. Rehema slid the hooked rope into the gap and began pulling back slowly, trying to shift the coil's angle without triggering the snake to react violently. The lioness gave a shuddering gasp, then went still again. Her eyes fluttered closed. David's heart sank. "Come on, girl." "Not yet." Juma stood behind them, scanning the tall grass. His eyes narrowed. "We've got company," he said grimly. A pair of hyenas had emerged from the nearby brush. Ears perked, drawn by the scent of blood and the sounds of struggle. One let out a low whoop and crept closer, tongue lolling. "Get rid of them," David snapped. Juma fired a warning shot into the dirt with a flare gun. The burst of light and noise startled the hyenas, and they scattered temporarily. Rehema turned, pulling her machete from its sheath and taking a defensive stance just in case they returned. The python, now agitated by the noise, began to twist violently. Its head struck at Joseph's pole with sudden force, knocking him off balance. "I can't hold it," Joseph yelled, stumbling back. David acted fast. He leapt forward and drove his own weight down on the crowbar, using all his strength to wedge between the coils. The iron bar groaned but didn't bend. Rehema joined him, gripping the rope, pulling hard. Inch by inch, the tension shifted. Then came the turning point. The lioness coughed. It was wet, ragged, but it was sound. Her eyes fluttered open again, hazy but not gone. Her ribs expanded just slightly under the loosened pressure. "Now!" David roared. Together, the two rangers wrenched the coil outward. Joseph recovered, lunged again with his pole and jabbed it firmly against the snake's head, forcing it to recoil in confusion. In that moment, the python's control broke. The top coil slipped. Its body rippled in a spasm of frustration. The lioness, sensing her chance, gave a weak but desperate push with her back legs. The final coil loosened. She was free. The male lion roared so loudly it echoed across the plains. Without hesitation, he rushed forward and stood protectively between his mate and the snake, his golden mane bristling with fury. The python, outnumbered and outmatched, retreated. It slid back into the tall grass in eerie silence, leaving behind only a long trail in the dust and a heavy, terrifying memory. The lioness collapsed on the road, gasping and trembling. The male lion lowered his head beside hers, nuzzling her neck, licking her wounds in gentle strokes. The rangers lowered their tools, their chests heaving. Sweat streamed down their faces, their arms shaking with exhaustion. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Joseph said, "Horse. That's the closest I've ever been to a python that size." David crouched beside the lioness, watching her breathing stabilize. "And the closest she's been to death." Behind them, the hyenas had reappeared, watching silently from the shadows, but Juma raised his hand and they slunk away, realizing they'd missed their opportunity. Rehema walked over, voice quiet. "She'll survive." David nodded, then stood, surveying the scene. "We came at the right time." 5 minutes later, no one finished the sentence. Instead, they watched as the lioness slowly pushed herself up, legs trembling. The male stood beside her, as if offering silent encouragement. She took one step, then another, each movement cautious but determined. Together, the lions turned away from the road and walked into the golden grass. At the edge, the male paused. He looked back, just once, his gaze sweeping over the ranges. And then he vanished into the wild with his mate. Joseph exhaled and sat on the truck's bumper. "That," he said, "was a war." David nodded, wiping blood and dust from his hands. "A war we were lucky to win." Rehema looked down the road, voice soft. "They wouldn't have stood a chance alone." David didn't reply. He just stared after the lions, watching the grass sway in their wake. In the Serengeti, life and death danced closely. Every heartbeat was hard-won. And today, because they were there, one heartbeat had been saved. The rangers packed their gear and returned to the vehicle in silence. The road ahead was still long, the sun still hot, and the wild still unforgiving. But they had done what they came to do. And they would do it again. The heat of the Serengeti was relentless, pressing down like an invisible weight on the backs of the rangers. Dust clung to their clothes. Sweat soaked their collars, and their lungs burned from effort, but no one stopped. They had come too far. The python's monstrous body writhed in agitation now, its coils losing the fluid, predatory elegance they had held earlier. Each movement had become erratic, desperate. It could feel its grip slipping, not just physically, but in the way that only a predator knows when the tide has turned. The battle was no longer in its favor. David's hands trembled as he forced the crowbar deeper under the coil that had wrapped tightly around the lioness's ribs. With every inch they loosened. The lioness seemed to breathe just a little easier. Joseph grunted as he drove the reinforced stick against the snake's thick midsection. Careful not to break its spine but firm enough to make it shift. Rehema, rope in hand, pulled with everything she had. Her palms were raw, skin rubbed pink by the friction. But she didn't let go. "It's coming loose," she gasped. The lioness, still splayed on the asphalt, gave a weak growl, more a whisper than a warning, but a sound that brought instant energy to the team. "Keep going," David shouted, his voice hoarse. With a final push, an exhausted, straining chorus of effort, the last major coil loosened. The lioness slipped free. For a breathless moment, the world stilled. The massive serpent hissed furiously, its body twisting in protest as its prey was torn from its grasp. But before it could retaliate, the lioness was already being dragged a few feet away by David and Rehema. Cradled between their arms like a wounded soldier, she lay gasping, her chest rising and falling in jagged rhythm, her eyes dull but alive. Her powerful body, scarred and bruised, now trembled in the breeze. Then, before the rangers could react, the male lion moved. He stepped forward from the roadside, muscles taut, head low. For a moment, the python raised its head again as if to defend its ground. But something in the lion's gaze, something ancient and primal, caused it to hesitate. And then, with deliberate steps, the male approached his mate. He lowered his massive head and gently pressed his muzzle against her cheek. Then came a moment no one watching would ever forget. The lion opened his mouth and let out a long, thunderous roar, a sound of fury, grief, triumph, and love. It echoed across the open savanna, scattering a flock of birds from nearby trees, and rolled out into the dry air like a wave. It was not just a warning to the predator. It was a declaration to the wild. She is alive. The python finally retreated. It slithered back into the grass in long, undulating motions, its massive form blending with the sun-drenched vegetation. Though defeated, It moved with the calm dignity of an ancient force retreating into the shadows, leaving only silence and fear in its wake. The rangers staggered back, falling to their knees or leaning against the truck. No one spoke for a while. They were soaked in sweat, muscles trembling from adrenaline. But it wasn't just physical exhaustion that overcame him, it was emotional release. Joseph sat down hard on the road, his stick falling from his hands. "I can't believe we did it," he whispered. Rehema sank to the ground next to the lioness, still cautiously distant, but unable to stop watching the lions. "I thought she was gone." David was quiet, hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. He looked at the lioness, who was slowly, shakily raising her head to meet her mates. She gave a low, soft growl, barely audible, but full of life. It was enough. Juma, ever watchful, scanned the horizon and then raised the radio to his lips. "Base, this is Patrol Alpha. Emergency at Sector 6B. Large feline injury. Lioness down. Stable. Request medical team and wildlife response unit." The reply crackled in with a burst of static. "Copy that. Patrol Alpha. Rescue team en route. ETA 20 minutes. Secure the site." David stood slowly and walked toward the two lions. The male, protective but not aggressive, looked up and met his gaze. There was no challenge in the lion's eyes now, only recognition. Mutual respect. They had all fought the same enemy and come out alive. "Let's clear the road," David said quietly. The rangers moved efficiently, sweeping the path, checking for other threats, and setting perimeter markers for the incoming team. They kept their distance from the lions, who now lay side by side in the shade of a low acacia. The lioness leaning against her mate, both breathing slowly in sync. The tension in the air had lifted, replaced by something sacred, a kind of stillness that only came after a miracle. Minutes passed. Then, in the distance, the hum of an approaching vehicle. The rescue truck arrived in a cloud of dust, bright white against the red-gold earth. Out stepped two veterinarians and a conservation officer, all moving quickly but calmly. David met them halfway and gave a rapid report. Injuries consistent with crush trauma. No visible bleeding. Respiration shallow but improving. She's mobile, just weak. Male is protective. No aggression shown toward humans during intervention. The team moved in carefully, sedating the lioness just enough for examination. The male lion watched, ears forward, tail flicking, but made no move to interfere. It was as if he understood that these strange creatures, who had pulled his mate from death's grip, could be trusted. "She'll recover," the lead vet said after a tense few minutes. "Nothing's broken, no internal bleeding. She's lucky, damn lucky." David and Joseph looked at each other, relief washing over them like a wave, as the lioness was loaded gently onto the recovery stretcher for short-term care and observation. The male lion rose. He didn't follow at first, just watched, gaze intense. Then, after a few seconds, he trotted behind the vet team, never once letting his mate out of sight. Rehema smiled through tears. "He's not letting her go." The rangers watched as the truck pulled away, flanked by a follow-up vehicle carrying the conservation team. The dust trailed behind them like a ribbon of smoke. And then the road was quiet again. David sat on the hood of the Land Cruiser, his shirt soaked through, his arms aching from the fight. "What we saw today," he began, voice rough, "that was more than survival." Joseph nodded, sitting beside him. "It was love. Raw, fierce. We risk everything for each other out here. Animals, humans, doesn't matter." Rehema leaned against the truck. "It wasn't just a rescue. It was a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Juma asked. "That nature," she said softly, "doesn't just need protection. It needs compassion." And in that moment, as the wind danced through the tall grass and the clouds cast slow-moving shadows over the land, the team sat in silence, watching the savannah return to calm. They had witnessed something that would never make the headlines. No glory, no medals, but it would live in their hearts forever. A miracle. In the middle of the road, the rescue truck rolled into the Wildlife Conservation Center just as the last light of day began to fade from the Serengeti sky. The tires crunched softly over the gravel path, followed closely by the escort vehicle carrying the conservation officers. Inside the mobile veterinary bay, the Lioness lay still, sedated, yet alive. Her chest moved slowly, rhythmically, as if each breath had to relearn its pattern. Monitors beeped softly, a saline drip fed into her vein. Every soul in the center was holding their breath. The rangers were there to meet her. David, Joseph, Rehema, and Juma walked quietly beside the vet team as the stretcher was gently lowered to the ground and wheeled toward the enclosure prepared for trauma recovery. The Lioness had been through something nearly no one had witnessed. A python attack survived. The odds defied. But it was not just the Lioness who arrived that night. The male lion, her mate, had followed every step. He did not try to leap into the vehicle, did not growl or panic. But he followed, always at a safe distance, always with his eyes fixed on her. He watched as she was moved inside, then settled down in the brush just beyond the fence line, where he remained, vigilant, unmoving. That night, and every night after, he slept there. The conservationists, at first cautious, quickly realized there was no threat. The lion made no attempt to breach the perimeter. He simply stayed, watching, waiting. Inside the enclosure, the Lioness began her slow road to recovery. She had bruised ribs, internal swelling, a torn muscle in her hind leg, and signs of trauma from oxygen deprivation. But thanks to the timing of the rescue and the skill of the medical team, her condition stabilized within 24 hours. Rehema, during the first morning checkup, placed a gentle hand against the Lioness's flank and said softly, "We should give her a name." David looked up from the medical chart. "Any thoughts?" Rehema nodded. "Shani. It means, light, in Swahili." She came back from the darkness. The name stuck. From then on, she wasn't just a number in a logbook, she was Shani, the Lioness who roared back from death. Over the next week, Shani's recovery amazed everyone. On the second day, she managed to sit upright. On the fourth, she drank water from the trough on her own. By the sixth, she was walking, limping slightly, but moving steadily. Each milestone was met with careful observation, cautious celebration, and quiet awe. But what touched the rangers most was not just Shani's healing. It was his presence. The male lion, whom they had started calling Baraka, Blessing, never left the perimeter of her enclosure. He would lie in the shade during the hottest part of the day, ears twitching to every sound inside. At dusk, he would walk slow, lazy circles around the fence, sometimes lying down with his body facing hers. Even though a barrier stood between them, he didn't pace, he didn't growl, he simply waited. On the 8th day, a young ranger named Imani sat quietly at the edge of the enclosure, notebook in hand, a recent graduate from wildlife studies. This was her first field posting, and the events of the past week had left her both shaken and inspired. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold and lilac, she watched Baraka lay near the fence again, just 10 meters from Shani, who was curled up in the straw under the observation platform. Imani opened her notebook. She had been keeping a journal since the day they rescued Shani, a way to process the whirlwind of adrenaline, fear, and wonder. That evening, she wrote, "I used to think animals lived only by instinct. That they ran, fought, ate, and mated because their bodies told them to. But now I'm not so sure. I watched this lioness barely cling to life while her mate roared in despair. I saw how he followed her, night after night, sleeping outside her pen, never leaving, and when she stood for the first time, even before she was strong enough to roar, he roared for her. This isn't just instinct, it's devotion. They feel fear, they feel pain, and they love, just like us. Shani and Baraka taught me that to protect wildlife isn't just about preserving species. It's about honoring the bonds they form, the lives they live, because their stories matter, just as much as ours do." Imani closed the notebook, tucked it under her arm, and stood across the enclosure. Baraka lifted his head and met her eyes. For a moment, she felt as though he saw straight through her, not as a threat, not even as a rescuer, but as a witness, a keeper of his and Shani's story. By the 10th day, the vet confirmed that Shani could soon be moved to a larger semi-wild enclosure for mobility training and pre-release evaluation. She was walking more confidently now, eating without hesitation, and reacting sharply to sounds and smells. Baraka, ever her sentinel, rose and moved with her. When she paced near the east wall, so did he, on the other side. When she lay near the water trough, he mirrored her posture. Their bond was unspoken but absolute. The staff began discussing the logistics of reintroducing them to the wild together. Though such cases were rare, they agreed this situation demanded something different. "They've come through too much to be separated," David said in one meeting. "We owe them that chance." The decision was made. When Shani was ready, she and Baraka would return to the wild as a pair. The rescue center began preparing a release plan in coordination with wildlife authorities. On the 14th day, the gates of the enclosure were opened for the first time. Shani stepped forward slowly, eyes scanning the familiar form of her mate just ahead of her. Baraka stood and turned toward her. There was no grand display. No roar. Just a moment of reunion. She crossed the line between enclosure and wild without hesitation. Pressed her head against his chest. And they walked off together into the tall, golden grass, side by side. Amani, watching from the shade of the trees, wrote one last entry in her notebook. When we first saw Shani on that road, trapped in the coils of death, I feared we were too late. But somehow, we weren't. She chose to live, he chose to wait, and we chose to believe it was worth fighting for. We didn't just save a lion. We saved a bond, a love, a reminder that in this world of wildness and wonder, hope still walks on four paws. Back at the station, the rangers gathered that evening around the fire, their work for the day done. The air was warm, filled with the sound of cicadas and distant hyena calls. I wonder where they'll go, Juma said. Wherever they want, Joseph replied, smiling faintly. They've earned it. David poked at the fire. There'll be more rescues, more danger, more pythons. But this will stay with me. Rehema nodded. They showed us what we're really protecting. In the vastness of the Serengeti, under a sky filled with stars, two lions walked forward into freedom, watched by the ones who had risked everything to give them another chance. And behind them, a story lingered, not just of survival, but of love, devotion, and the quiet miracles that happen when compassion meets courage. The sun rose gently over the Serengeti, casting long golden rays that turned the grasses into an endless sea of light. The early morning was quiet, save for the distant call of birds greeting the new day. Dew clung to the tips of tall blades of grass, shimmering like 1,000 tiny stars. And the air was still, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Inside the Wildlife Conservation Center, the atmosphere was hushed and reverent. Today was the day. Shani had fully recovered. Her ribs had healed. Her gait was steady, and her muscles had regained their fluid strength. The once fading light in her eyes now burned bright. Each movement she made was full of life, purpose, and wildness. But perhaps most telling of all was how calm she had become, how ready she seemed. Baraka, ever her silent guardian, remained by her side through every phase of her healing. He had matched her step for step in the semi-wild enclosure. They hunted together under supervision, played together like young lions rediscovering the joy of freedom, and slept with their backs pressed close, the way wild lions do when their bond is deeper than mere instinct. Now, the two stood together at the open gate of the reserve's rewilding field, the final checkpoint before true wilderness began. The rangers gathered near the enclosure fence. David stood with his arms crossed, his eyes misted with emotion. Joseph stood beside him, a camera slung loosely around his neck, though for once he made no move to raise it. Rehema held the gate controls, her hand resting gently on the lever. Juma paced slowly nearby, eyes scanning the horizon, and Amani, the youngest among them, held her well-worn notebook pressed against her chest. The wind carried a light breeze, rustling the dry grass, brushing softly against their cheeks as if nature itself were whispering its blessing. David took a slow breath. "Are we ready?" Everyone nodded, silently. "Then let's do this." Rehema pulled the lever. With a quiet click and a gentle creak, the wide metal gate began to swing open. Beyond it, nothing stood between the lions and the plains. No fences. No walls. Only freedom. Shani stepped forward first. She moved gracefully, ears twitching, eyes wide with recognition. This was her world. This was home. Baraka followed closely, pausing only for a second before pacing beside her. Together, they passed the threshold between the life they had known in captivity and the wildness that had waited for them all along. They walked 10 meters, 20, then paused, as if on some unspoken cue. Both lions turned back. Their eyes swept over the ranges, not with fear, nor confusion, but with something deeper. A stillness, a connection, as though they understood, even if only instinctively, that the ones behind them had done something rare and sacred. They had not just intervened in nature's violence, they had honored its spirit. Baraka raised his head and let out a low rumble, not a roar, but a soft, resonant sound that vibrated in the earth beneath their feet. And then, together, they turned and walked into the golden sea of grass. No one spoke for a long time. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the savanna as the lions disappeared into the horizon. 2 tawny figures swallowed by the sun-kissed landscape. Amani finally broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, reverent. They looked back. Rehema smiled gently. They said thank you. Joseph nodded, not with words, but with heart. David exhaled, long and deep, and now they belonged to the wild again. The group stood there, still watching the grass sway. The gate now standing open and empty. The moment lingered, not out of sadness, but because they knew it was rare. These were the kinds of moments that reminded them why they endured the long days. The dust, the danger, the heartbreak, the why behind the work. Juma, still watching the spot where the lions had disappeared, finally said, "The wild is cruel sometimes, unforgiving, but today, it gave something back." Amani, tears in her eyes, opened her notebook and began writing slowly. Her hand trembled a little, but her words were steady. Nature is not just a battlefield of survival, it is a place of fierce, undeniable love. Shani and Baraka taught us that. They fought for each other. They waited for each other. They healed, not just because of us, but because of their bond. And now, they return to the wild, not as victims, but as symbols, proof that compassion can cross species. That love lives even where life is hardest. She closed the notebook and looked toward David. He smiled at her, then turned to the others. His voice was quiet but firm. "Every creature we help," he said, "every life we save, it's a piece of nature we give back. A heartbeat we preserve, a reminder that our job isn't just to protect. It's to care." His words settled into the air like a final note in a song. They walked back to the station slowly, the gate still open behind them, the wind blowing gently in their wake. The sun rose higher, casting the Serengeti in a brilliance of gold, painting the earth with light and legacy. Shani and Baraka were gone now, but not lost. They were out there, among the herds. The brush, the shadows and sun, part of the living, breathing rhythm of the wild. And the ranges remained guardians, witnesses, keepers of stories that would never be printed on paper, but carved forever into the land. Because even in a place as harsh and untamed as the Serengeti, one truth stood firm: love, whether human or animal, has the power to save lives. And sometimes, that love is all the world needs to keep going.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.